Okay, we're going to jump into lesson 19.1b here, which is going to be graphing the cosine function here. And so for this one, going to be really similar to our last lesson where we talked about using the radian measurements on the xy axis here. They've got the table filled in for me. This time we're using cosine of x instead of sine. And so once again, they're just taking these x values and plugging them in and then evaluating. So cosine of 0 would give me 1. Cosine of pi over 2 would give me 0. Cosine of pi gives me -1, and so on and so on. And you could check that on your calculator if you'd like to evaluate those. Notice I made the amendment over here and changed that to cosine of x because I think on the note sheet it's a typo. And then once again, we're splitting up this x-axis into those major points from the circle that we talked about last time, which are also in our table here. We've got 0, of course, and then we've got pi over 2 is the first one. Pi is the next tick mark. 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi would be all the way around the circle, and that's the end of my cycle there. And so then what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and plot these points for cosine. It's going to look similar to sine, except notice right off the bat that cosine starts at 0, 1. So that means it starts up here at 1. So cosine starts at 1. So that's kind of the difference here, that sine starts at 0, remember, but cosine starts at 1, and then it just goes through that same pattern. So then it goes down to 0, down to -1, back to 0, and then finishes up at 1. So one full cycle will look something like this. Okay. So that would be one full cycle there, right? I, of course, could do the same thing on the other side for the negative pi over 2, negative pi, -3 pi over 2, -2 pi. Okay, and I could do the same thing on that side. It would just follow the same pattern there, where this time it's going to go down to -1, back up to 0, and finish up at +1. And so this is where the period is 2 pi, right? So a full 2 pi starting at 0, and then going over to 2 pi, we get through one full cycle. So that's what my cosine curve looks like, kind of like this little valley here, right? So instead of having like an up and a down, right, it just kind of has this valley here for cosine. And then it's got all the same pieces that we talked about last lesson, right? A, that'll control the amplitude, how high up and how high down my graph goes. B, that'll control the period, right? So how many cycles do we have to get through by those certain tick marks on the period, okay? And then, of course, if A is negative, it would be reflected, okay? So for this one, we've got A is equal to 3. So that's going to change my amplitude, how high up and how high down I'm going, right? So first I'm going to label my pieces here. We've got pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and 2 pi. Okay, and then I'm going to go ahead and plot these. So instead of starting at 1, which is where I normally start for cosine, I'm going to shoot that up to 3. And then it just follows that same pattern. So down to 0, down to -3, back up to 0, and back up to +3. So it's just following this pattern, right? Let's try that again. Okay, it kind of looks like a V, but it should be more curved. And then from there, we could follow the same pattern to the other side. Okay, so it's going to look something like that. And so we end up with these cosine curves, right? One on the positive side, one on the negative side. And again, the period is just full 2 pi, right? A full 2 pi because there was no change in the x part there of the equation. If we go to letter B, same idea here. Except for this one, we've got the negative sign that's in the front. So now, instead of starting at 1, which is where cosine normally starts, we're going to start at -1, and then we're going to go up to 0, then up to +1, down to 0, and then finish at -1. So it's going to look something like this. So an upside down cosine curve, right? And we could do the same thing on the other side. Okay, just follow this pattern up, and then back down, and finishing at -1. Okay, so we'd end up there. Notice again, there's no number next to x, so the period did not change. All right. Now we're getting to letter C. This is where the period will change because notice we have a number in there with x, right? So we have a b value. So I'm going to say the period, this is always the formula, is going to be 2 pi divided by whatever that number is. In this case, it's 2. So that means my period is going to be pi. So remember, it goes pi over 2, and then pi is the second tick mark. And I've got to get through one full cycle of my cosine curve by the time I hit there, right? And so remember, there should always be 4 tick marks there, 3 and 4 to get through one cycle. Right now, we've got 2 tick marks here, 1 and 2 by the time I need to finish that cycle. So I'm going to split each one of those pieces in half, okay, to get my 4. So it's evenly divided. So I've got my 4 tick marks there. And so then I'm going to go ahead and draw my cosine curve. Remember, cosine starts at 1. So we'll start up at 1. And then we're going to hit 0, down to -1, back up to 0, and then finishing at 1. And so we end up there with this cosine curve, which has kind of been scrunched up a little bit. We get through one full cycle by the time we hit pi. And we can do the same thing on the other side. Okay, first, by the time I get to negative pi, I should have one full cycle. I'm going to go ahead and split this up into 4 sections. And then I'm going to go ahead and plot my points. So down, and then back up, and finishing up at 1. Okay, and so we end up there, right, where we've got this cosine curve, but it's been scrunched up, so we're getting through one full cycle by the time we hit pi because our period has changed to pi. Okay, moving down to letter D, same idea here. We've got changes in the amplitude first, which is 3. So that means we're going to be starting at 3. Remember, cosine normally starts at 1, but we'll start at 3 because it's getting stretched upwards vertically. And then my period is also changing. So the period here is going to be 2 pi divided by whatever my b value is, in this case 4. And that, of course, reduces to pi over 2. So that means by the time I hit pi over 2 and negative pi over 2, I need to go through one full cycle. So first, let's start at the positive one here, right? Just like before, I need 4 tick marks. So first, I'm going to split this in half, and then I'm going to split that in half again. And I've got my 1, 2, 3, 4 tick marks there. And now I can go ahead and draw this cosine curve, keeping in mind that instead of starting at 1, which is where cosine normally starts, it's going to start at 3. So I'm all the way up here at positive 3. And then I'm going to come down to 0, down to -3, back to 0, and then finish back up at positive 3. So we're getting through one full cycle of this curve. Okay, one full cycle of that curve by the time we hit pi over 2. And we can do the same thing on the other side. Okay, I need the 4 tick marks. There's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. And then I can go ahead and sketch this thing. So again, starting at 3 and then dropping down to 0, dropping down to 0, and then down to -3, back to 0, and then finishing up back here at positive 3. So the negative side here, looking something like that. And as I zoom out, you can see that that's been super scrunched up, right? So the full period by the time we hit pi over 2, and then on the negative side, a full period by the time we hit negative pi over 2. And then lastly here, we're going to go to -2 times cosine of x. So for this one, it's going to be a reflection. So normally I start at positive 1, but I'm going to reflect that to be -1. And then I'm going to change that even because we have a 2 here. So I'm going to start at -2. Okay. Notice that the period is not changing, so I'm going to get all the way to 2 pi by the time this thing finishes up here. And so now instead of starting by going down, I'm going to go up, and then up to positive 2, down to 0, and then finish at -2. So this is a upside down sine curve here. Okay, so it looks like that, upside down. and it's been stretched to 2 and -2 because of the amplitude change there. And we can do the same thing on the other side. Okay, up to 2, back to 0, and then finishing at -2. Okay, and we end up there. All right, that's it. Thanks for watching.